I can't control myself around you, the mountain man said quietly, his voice rough as pine bark worn thin by years of wind. The words weren't a threat. They were a confession. He stood just inside the doorway of his cabin, one broad shoulder braced against the frame, as if holding back more than the storm raging outside. Snow blew sideways in thick, blinding sheets, swallowing the narrow trail she'd followed up the mountain until there was no trail at all, only white and silence and the pounding of her heart. She hadn't planned to end up here. The hike was supposed to be a simple shortcut before dusk,
you're my
a last
warmth
push
in this
before winter
cold,
truly
and
locked
you're
the
my
mountains
light.
away. But the sky had turned on her without warning.
You're my
cold had
warmth
sharpened
in this
fast,
cold,
biting
and
through
you're
her
my
gloves,
light.
numbing her fingers. When she saw the faint glow of lamplight through the trees, she thought she was imagining it. When she knocked, she expected no answer. Instead, the door opened, and there he was, tall, solid, eyes the color of storm clouds, beard dusted with snow like frost on stone. I just need to warm up, she said, voice shaking more from exhaustion than fear. The storm, I lost the trail. He studied her for a long moment, taking in the tremor in her hands, the way she leaned forward as if the wind might steal her balance. Something unreadable passed over his face before he stepped aside. Get in, before you freeze. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and pine sap. It was small, tidy in a way that suggested routine rather than comfort. A single table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with tools and jars, a cast iron stove glowing with steady heat. She stepped inside, stamping snow from her boots, aware of how loud she seemed in the quiet space. He shut the door quickly, bolting it against the storm, then took a step back, as if distance itself were necessary. That was when he said it. The warning, calm, controlled, but edged with something raw. She blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. You, what? I live alone for a reason, he said, turning away to add a log to the fire. His movements were careful, deliberate. People come through here sometimes. I help when I can. But you, he stopped, the fire snapping loudly between them. You should know the truth. She laughed once, softly, more from nerves than humor. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need a few hours. Maybe until morning. He nodded, still not looking at her. That's what scares me. The honesty of it disarmed her. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the warmth seep back into her bones, and studied him in return. He wasn't wild the way stories made mountain men sound. There was no madness in his eyes, no cruelty in his stance. What she saw instead was restraint, thick as iron, stretched tight. A man who had built walls not to keep others out, but to keep himself contained. The wind slammed against the cabin, rattling the windows. She jumped, instinctively stepping closer to the stove. The firelight painted her face gold, caught in her hair, softened the shadows beneath her eyes. He noticed. He always noticed, though he wished he didn't. Sit, he said, gesturing to a chair. I'll make tea. As he moved, she became acutely aware of the space between them, how small it was, how full it felt. The cabin seemed to shrink, every sound amplified, the hiss of the kettle, the crackle of the fire, the quiet rhythm of his breathing. She sensed that if either of them moved the wrong way, something would break. Or begin. Why warn me? She asked gently. He poured the water, hands steady despite the tension coiled in his shoulders. Because you deserve to know where you are. And who you're with. She accepted the mug, their fingers nearly touching. The near contact sent a strange awareness through her, not fear, but clarity. He wasn't dangerous because he lacked control. He was dangerous because he had too much of it, held for too long. Outside, the storm showed no sign of mercy. Inside, the warning hung between them, unanswered. She didn't step back, and he didn't ask her to leave. Night came early in the mountains, folding itself around the cabin like a thick, soundless blanket. The storm still prowled outside, but its fury had dulled into a steady, relentless wind that pressed against the walls and whispered through the cracks. Inside, the fire burned low and steady, casting long shadows that stretched and shifted with every movement. The cabin felt smaller now, not because of the walls, but because of the awareness growing between them, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. He moved with purpose, keeping busy as if stillness might betray him. He washed the single mug she had used, wiped the table that hadn't been dirty, adjusted the log pile beside the stove though it was already neatly stacked. Each task was a barrier, a way to keep his hands occupied and his thoughts in check. She watched from the chair, her fingers curled around the warmth of the tea, noticing how often his gaze flicked toward her reflection in the small window before he caught himself and looked away. You don't have to stay standing, she said. I'm not going anywhere. He paused, shoulders stiff. That's the problem. She should have bristled, should have felt unwelcome. Instead, curiosity tugged at her. You make it sound like I'm some kind of test. His mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost a grimace. Maybe you are. He finally sat across from her, choosing the chair farthest away, though the distance was still barely an arm's length. Up close, she could see the fine lines etched by sun and cold at the corners of his eyes, the old scar cutting through his beard along his jaw. He looked like a man shaped by weather and solitude, someone who had learned to listen more than speak. Silence settled between them, not awkward, just heavy with things neither knew how to say. She broke it first. How long have you been up here? Long enough that the mountain feels louder than people, he replied. And safer. People aren't always dangerous, she said softly. He met her gaze then, really met it, and something tightened in his expression. No, he agreed, but wanting them can be. The fire popped, sending a small spray of sparks upward. She flinched, and without thinking, he reached out, stopping himself just short of touching her arm. His hand hovered in the space between them, fingers flexing as if he were fighting an instinct older than reason. He drew it back slowly, curling it into a fist and pressing it to his thigh. I warned you, he said, voice lower now. I heard you, she replied. I just don't think you're talking about what you think you are. Her words unsettled him. He stood abruptly and turned toward the window, staring out at the swirling darkness. You don't know me. No, she said, rising as well, though she stayed where she was. But I know loneliness when I see it. And I know fear that pretends to be control. That struck deeper than he wanted to admit. He'd spent years convincing himself that isolation was strength, that desire was a weakness best starved into silence. Yet here she was, standing in his cabin, breathing his air, unraveling that certainty without even trying. You should sleep, he said, the words coming out rough. The storm won't clear until morning. Where will you go? She asked. I'll take the bench, he answered quickly. You can have the bed. She hesitated, then nodded. Only if you promise you'll rest too. He let out a short, humorless breath. Rest isn't the problem. As she settled onto the narrow bed, he busied himself dimming the lantern, stoking the fire one last time. The light softened, turning the cabin into a world of amber and shadow. He lay back on the bench, staring up at the ceiling beams, every sense attuned to the smallest sounds, the shift of the mattress, the quiet cadence of her breathing. Sleep didn't come. Instead, awareness stretched between them like a live wire. He thought of his warning, of how easily it could be misunderstood. It wasn't about losing control in a moment of madness. It was about how quickly one person could make another want something more than solitude. How dangerous hope could be when you'd buried it deep. In the dark, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for letting me stay. He closed his eyes, letting the words settle. You're safe here, he said, and meant more than just the night. Outside, the storm began to ease, but inside the cabin, the tension held, quiet, restrained, and waiting for morning to decide what it would become. Morning crept in slowly, pale light seeping through the frost-laced windowpanes and softening the sharp edges of the night. The storm had moved on, leaving behind a hush so complete it felt sacred. Snow lay thick and untouched around the cabin, the world reset to white and still. For a moment, neither of them moved, as if waking might shatter something fragile that had formed in the dark. He was the first to rise. His body protested the stiff bench, but he welcomed the ache, it grounded him. He pulled on his boots quietly, careful not to wake her, and opened the door just enough to let in a slice of cold air. The mountain greeted him like an old companion, silent and watchful. He breathed deeply, steadying himself, reminding his heart that dawn meant distance, that she would leave, and life would return to its careful order. Behind him, the bed creaked softly. She sat up, hair loose around her shoulders, eyes still heavy with sleep. For a second, she looked out of place in his cabin, like a dream that had wandered into reality. Then she smiled faintly, and the room felt warmer than the fire ever made it. The storm's gone, she said. Yes, he replied, turning to face her. The trail should be visible now. Neither of them moved to act on that fact. He poured water into the kettle, the familiar routine a comfort. She joined him at the table, wrapping the blanket around herself, her presence no longer startling but still deeply felt. The warning he'd given her echoed in his mind, sharper now in daylight. He wondered if she'd taken it as drama, as mystery. He wondered if she understood how close he'd come, not to harming her, but to wanting a life he'd long convinced himself he couldn't have. I meant what I said, he told her quietly as the kettle heated. About not being able to control myself. She studied him for a long moment. I know, she said. But I think you misunderstood your own words. He frowned slightly. How so? You're not afraid of losing control, she said gently. You're afraid of choosing. The kettle whistled, sharp and sudden. He took it off the stove, hands steady, though something inside him had shifted. Choosing meant risk. It meant letting someone see past the walls he'd built plank by plank. It meant accepting that solitude wasn't the same as peace. He set a mug in front of her. If you stay, he said carefully, I won't pretend this place won't change me. She wrapped her fingers around the mug, absorbing the warmth. I'm not asking you to promise anything, she said. I just don't want you to hide behind fear and call it control. Outside, a bird called, the sound startling in the silence. He looked toward the door, then back at her. The mountain had always been his answer, unchanging, honest, demanding nothing but respect. But, now there was another answer sitting across from him, just as honest, just as dangerous in her own way. I can walk you part of the way down, he said at last. She nodded, understanding the weight of that offer. They bundled up, the cabin suddenly feeling less like a refuge and more like a threshold. Before leaving, she paused, her hand resting on the rough wooden table. You saved me last night, she said. He shook his head. You would have survived. Maybe, she agreed. But I'm glad I didn't have to. They stepped outside together, boots crunching softly in the fresh snow. The trail was there now, winding down through the trees, clear and bright beneath the rising sun. They walked in silence for a while, breath visible in the cold air, their steps naturally falling into rhythm. At the bend where the path widened, she stopped. This is far enough, she said. He nodded, though something in his chest resisted. Be careful, she hesitated, then reached out, her gloved hand brushing his sleeve, brief, deliberate, enough. You too, she said. And, don't disappear just because it's easier. She turned and started down the trail, her figure growing smaller with each step. He watched until she vanished among the trees. Only then did he turn back toward the cabin. It stood as it always had, solid and quiet. Yet when he stepped inside, it no longer felt the same. The warning he'd given her lingered, but now it sounded different, not like a threat, not even like fear. Some warnings, he realized, weren't meant to push people away. They were meant to mark the moment when everything could change.